Good morning. How are we going? Good. Awesome. We're in our series in Psalms. As we said, we've been sitting in the wisdom literatures for about 2 months now. We're in Proverbs, where we got to hear good sayings of words of wisdom that help to guide us and lead us. Now we're in the Psalms. The Psalms, if you don't know, are a collection of songs and poems. And what's so beautiful about that is that they are a type of art. Art being an expression of a human experience. So we get to see this raw, open, honest, and emotive expression of one of God's chosen and anointed vessels, that's King David, toward God. And it's beautiful, and it's rich. So I wanted to sort of ask a question today to help us lead us into this Psalm 13. Would you guys, can I ask this question? Is that okay? You guys want this question? Okay, cool. Let's go. The question is, would you characterize your relationship with God as intimate? Would you characterize your relationship with God as intimate? Do you feel the freedom to express yourself openly toward Him? Do you feel like you could ask Him any question? God, what's going on in this situation? What's happening? How long will you hide yourself from me? When you struggle with doubt or uncertainty, do you feel like you can express that to God, or does it make you feel ashamed, like you need to hide it and keep it hidden from Him? Psalm 13 is a demonstration of that kind of intimacy. It's a psalm of David. And David, as you may know, was God's chosen king. The Israelites had longed for a human king, so He allowed them to pick someone. They picked this guy called Saul, and Saul failed. He disregarded God. He disregarded His commandments. He wouldn't listen to His prophets. So God says, I'm gonna pick my own king. David's not out there trying to put his name forward. He doesn't have a good profile on LinkedIn. He's not trying to apply for that position. He's just a humble, lowly little shepherd boy who has a heart after God's own heart. And the Lord goes out and picks this man. And despite being picked throughout his life, David doesn't have it easy breezy. Many times he finds himself on the run, hiding in caves and living off the land, his life under threat. Everything he had imagined and hoped for his life to be now seems to be crumbling around. And it's out of that circumstance that David has written this psalm. It's an intense passage. But Psalm 13 also serves for us as a reflection of who our God is and a reflection of who He's calling each of us to be. One of my favorite stories from the Old Testament, which I think what's laying behind it is really foundational for us, and I was actually really excited to share it today, but it comes from the story of Jacob. You might know Jacob. He was one of God's chosen men who would lead and guide his people. And Jacob, one day, him and his brother Esau, they had a bit of a love-hate relationship. And they were meant to be meeting up. And so Jacob, to try and butter up his brother, make the conversation go a bit smoother, he gets his servants and he divides up his flock and he sends them ahead of him. And he says, each time you come and meet my brother Esau, say, this is a gift. This flock is a gift to you from your servant Jacob. He's just trying to butter him up and make it a bit of an easier conversation. He sends them all forward. Then he's just left with his friends and his family. And as he comes to this creek crossing, he sends them ahead of him. And then it says he's left alone. And then just quite suddenly, the next passage says, then Jacob wrestled a man. It's Jacob and just this man, and they're wrestling in this creek bed. As the story goes on, we realize that this man is what's known as a theophany, which is a manifestation of God's presence. And in this case, a very real, very tangible, very physical one. And so he's wrestling with God in this creek bed. It's quite bizarre. And God's allowing this wrestling match to be even. It says that they're wrestling all night. And as it was coming to daybreak, this man of God reaches out and touches Jacob on the hip, puts his hip out of joint. And he says, release me. Jacob says, I will not release you until you bless me. Jacob's recognizing this is God. He wants a blessing from God, so he won't let go. So the man of God says, what is your name? He says, my name is Jacob. And then we get this awesome verse. It says, then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Jacob hasn't given himself this name. God has given him this name, Israel. This is the origin story of the name Israel. It becomes the name of God's chosen people. And it becomes symbolic for us too, as each of us becoming believers, put our hope and our faith and trust into Jesus, having grafted into this family, Israel. But what's so significant about the name Israel is what it means. It's a Hebrew word. It's broken up into two parts. First of all, Yisra and El. Yisra means to strive or to contend with. El meaning God. So who are God's people? Who has he called them to be? He literally has named us as people who strive with him, who contend with him. We who wrestle with God. That's the invitation of who God is calling us to be. Never once since Eden has he called us to be mindless robots or the puppets without a soul. He's made each of us unique and individual, and he's given us the capacity for emotive response as well as an intellectual response. And he's calling us also into relationship with him. But sometimes I think as we become Christians, we suddenly feel obligated, and perhaps it's a cultural reason, we feel obligated to now suppress that emotive response. Out of fear that if we are honest, if we just react honestly from our emotions, we might be sinning against him. But he's called us into a deep relationship. Maybe it's also that we treat faith as being the absence of doubt. But that's not faith at all. True faith is a holding onto, a believing in what we know to be true despite the doubt, despite the uncertainty. And in the same way, a true relationship, an intimate and an honest relationship, is not a relationship without strife or without contention. We all know that. If you're married and you love your spouse, you fight, you strive, you contend, you question. But what marks a true, intimate relationship is a relationship that continues and survives despite that. This is a relationship that we'll be being called into. A relationship survives in the midst of conflict. To avoid conflict in a relationship is to avoid honesty. And if we fail to be honest, we will fail to be intimate. As God's people, we're being called to come and to contend and to wrestle with him, to be open and honest, to seek after that intimate relationship with him, to feel that we can lay out our heart and put our hope and our trust in him in all that we do. And David, in Psalm 13, lays out a framework of just how to do that. So if you have your Bibles, we're in Psalm 13, as Willow said. Reading from verse 1, we'll do verse 1 and 2. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Considering David's story, it probably doesn't surprise us that he feels that way. But maybe what is surprising to you is that he expresses that straight out to God. He comes in and begins accusing God. He says, like, God, I am your anointed, your chosen king. Are you going to forget me forever? You're going to turn your blessing away from me? It feels like you've abandoned me, like you've forgotten me, like I'm nothing to you anymore. And then he continues on. He's saying that I have to take counsel in my own soul. When God made a covenant with his people, with the Israelites, he'd promised to be their God, to be their mighty fortress, their safe refuge, the one who will deliver them from the hands of their enemies. He's saying, where are you now? I'm having to console myself. I feel like I can't turn to you. I'm having to turn inward and rely on myself. And lastly, he accuses God as well. My enemies, they have it over me. They have the upper hand. If I am your chosen king, if I'm your anointed, if you love me, then my enemies are your enemies and they're winning. What's going on? It's this raw, open expression of anguish and despair. It's a prayer of lament. We don't lament much in our Western culture, especially not in our Aussie culture. But what it means to lament is to express that anguish, that disappointment, that frustration, that confusion, to lay it out before God. And this honesty seems strange to us. It seems strange that he feels like he can just go toward the God of the universe and accuse him of not being present. This is the ever-present God, right? I have another question for you. Is God God? Yes. Is God God? Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Okay. Is God all-powerful? Yeah, of course he is. He's God. He's got to be all-powerful. Is God all-knowing? So he knows your thoughts. And he knows your feelings. Why do we keep them in? For whose sake are we withholding honesty from God? Probably for our own, right? He knows your thoughts. He knows your feelings. In fact, you guys would know Romans chapter 5, verse 8. Yeah, hopefully. It says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us, right? So when we were at our worst, at our darkest, our most sinful, our most rebellion, as we've heard in testimonies here, when we were enemies, when we hated God, when our hearts were full of filth, that's when he died for us. Why would he, knowing our thoughts, knowing our feelings, bring any sort of punishment against you if you were just being honest with him and laying it out? He's called you to be his people. He's called you into relationship with him. And if you fail to be honest, you will fail to be intimate. He's inviting us to come and lay out the anguish, the despair, the frustration, the confusion, the doubt at the feet of his son, Jesus. And he'll offer us freedom, but we'll get there later. He wants your openness and he wants your intimacy. Verse 3, consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice, because I am shaken. David shifts here from a position of accusation against God to now contending with him. There's something David needs, and he lays it out to God. He says, God, I need restoration. I need restoration. He says, I need you to light up my eyes. Now, David isn't being rude about this, but he's pointing out to God that if he is God's chosen king, if he is his anointed, the one who is meant to lead his people, and he's got enemies coming at him, he's got problems, well, David's problems have got to be God's problems. And you've got to help me out here, God. You've got to come and meet me and help me. How long will his enemies prevail over him? So David prays a prayer. He's contending with God, and he says that line. He says, this is what I need from you. I need you to light up my eyes. It's a strange thing to say. There's one other time where the word that's translated there appears in the Bible. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 14. And it's got Jonathan, who's the son of King Saul, with a bunch of Israelites, and they're chasing after the Philistines. They've been fighting them for days and days and days. King Saul, in his rashness, ordered his men, no one can eat until we eliminate every single last Philistine. But his men are tired, they're weary, and they're weak, and they're struggling to continue on with it. as they enter into this forest, Jonathan sees this honey. And like seeing that it was good and believing it to be from God, he takes off this honey and he eats it. Because in that moment, his eyes were brightened. You could just imagine someone who's weak and struggling and like slothful, takes off his honey and eats it, and they're suddenly full of strength and upright, and their eyes are bright and they're ready to go on. All this word means is just to refresh and to restore. And so in the midst of the anguish, the despair, the chaos, David's on the run, he's fearing for his life, he's probably watching his friends, his family, his closest advisors being murdered or killed or jailed. He cries out to God. It's like, where are you? And in the midst of it, all he asks for is just to light up my eyes. Restore my soul. Refresh my strength. That is his prayer. Why? We'll find it in the last two verses from this passage. He says, but I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. The key word here is but. David is hurt. He's frustrated. He's probably scared for his very own life. But David knows who God is. He knows that the God that he serves, the God who's come and chosen him and called him out, is God. He knows that he is everlasting. He knows that he is faithful. He knows that he's trustworthy, that he's good. He knows that he's Lord of all, he's creator of all, that in him, through him, and for him, all things were made. This is the God that David worships. Even in the midst of the despair and the anguish and things falling apart, he knows who his God is. And never once, despite the raw, emotive outpouring towards God, does David ever question God's character or his integrity. He doesn't doubt God's goodness. He doesn't question his faithfulness. He doesn't pick apart God's power, his capability, or his plan. Instead, in his first stanza, he asks, how long? Because it's not a question of if, but when. He knows that his God is faithful. Even in the pain, even in the turmoil, he knows his God will do it because he said, he's promised to David. He knows that he will come through on those promises. David believes that. He cries out to God for restoration because he knows that his God isn't the weak link, he is. God, I know you're faithful. I know you'll come through, but I am struggling to hold on. You've got to come and restore me. It's not something within myself that I need, but it's you. Your presence, your love, your power. I need you in the midst of my despair. It says, restore, God, light up my vision so I can keep my eyes on you. That's what David says. He says, I trust your steadfast love because you are trustworthy. I shall rejoice in your salvation because you are faithful. And I will sing to the Lord because look at how he has loved me. He's got his eyes on God. The depths of his heart is pleading with God, would you come and just interrupt this situation? Would you come and bring salvation to me? But he's also holding tension with that he knows who his God is. Even though the situation is awful, it's full of despair, it's destructive to him, he knows his God will come through and he's looking towards him. This is David's process of lament. Accusing God, in honesty in how he's feeling, contending with God, pleading for what he needs, and then praising God, acknowledging who his God is. He knows that if we fail to be honest, we'll fail to be intimate, and David is a man who we can look to who demonstrates an intimate, knowing relationship of who his God is. If you have your Bibles in front of you, you might notice as well that there's these spaces in between each of the sections. This isn't a creative editing decision. This is intentional. There is no guarantee to us that David wrote this entire psalm at once. In fact, he probably didn't. Most likely he wrote each section and he maybe went away in prayer. Maybe it was weeks. This process of lament when life throws us curveballs, when we go through deep suffering, when we're experiencing emotions of anguish and despair, we're not expected to just, put it on a shelf and it's gone. It's something we process through. It's something that we wrestle with. And we wrestle with God in the midst of it. Each gap represents that period of time that David wrestled with God. He wrestled with his circumstances. He wrestled with his sin. But the key is, David didn't sit in his frustration. David doesn't stay in his hurt. He ends up praising and knowing who his God is, and that is a depiction of true faith. A trust and hope in God in the midst of conflict. We're going to join together now in a time of communion. Our helpers are going to bring around the elements. If you are a believer and you're visiting today, we invite you to come and join with us in this meal. If you are still on that journey of faith and you have not yet placed your hope and trust in Jesus, we just ask you to let the elements pass you on by. I've got a story I've shared a few times now. You probably heard me share it before. But a few years ago, I joined an organization called PACE, a youth ministry organization. And I joined it and I went to the north side of Brisbane. And the process of me going there, I felt very clearly that God had called me. I felt that pressing on my heart. I prayed about it. I had conversations with people and it had confirmation around me. As I made that decision, I felt that sense of peace. Like this is where God was calling me to go. And as I said yes, just doors just seemed to open up for me. Everything seemed to fall into place, which is often, again, a confirmation. This is God's will. He's calling me to do this. I was really excited. I got up there and joined into this ministry, but as you may know, those 2 years were rough. I joined a ministry that was flourishing, had probably about 200 kids over 2 different programs on a Friday night, about 50 leaders, a thriving, vibrant church. And when I left, almost every single person I served with burnt out or left. Our youth ministries were struggling, they were failing. We had about 10 leaders left, and most of them were brand new. I'd pretty much trained all of them. They were fresh. And I was sort of standing there and looking back at it and going like, God, didn't you call me? Didn't you anoint me? Wasn't your hand over this? It seems so clear and obvious to me, and everything's just fallen apart. Everything's just collapsed. And I left that ministry feeling tired. I was probably experiencing some level of burnout. And for years afterwards, I really struggled to re-engage with God. I struggled coming to church. I didn't like praying. I felt frustrated when my wife was like, we should pray about this. I was like, what for? And then I went through this process of going through that emotion. And I realized I wasn't angry at the leaders who failed me in that moment. I wasn't angry at people who'd made some really silly decisions and ended up hurting myself and a large chunk of that church. I came to this point and I realized, God, I'm angry at you. I'm bitter at you. Didn't you call me to do this? And now I'm hurt. My friends are hurt. I watch people walk away from that church and walk away from their faith. I say, God, what is going on? And the strangest thing happened. I said, God, I'm angry and I'm bitter at you. And I wasn't. It was like a weight lifted off my body. And it was not long after that, I said to Haley, I'm like, I think I could serve again. Not long after that, like, God, I feel like I could be in ministry again. And what did God do? I was there, I was accusing him. God, I'm angry at you, I'm bitter at you. I felt you called me, I feel like you failed me. What did he do? Hi, I'm Matt, I'm one of the associate pastors here at Whitehill. He didn't punish me or cast me out. He's a good king. And he is righteous, but he's also your loving father. And he wants to have that deep, intimate relationship with you because he wants to set you free. He didn't call you to be a Christian to drag around with you all your shame and your guilt and your frustration for the rest of your life and throw your arms up at the end of the day and be like, well, that was hard, what was the point? No, he's come to set you free, to be present with you and walk with you. So what we're going to do today is a little bit different. As we take communion together, I'd like to walk through just a prayer of lament together. Would that be okay? I'm going to invite you, whatever you're comfortable with and whatever you're capable of, to put yourself into a position to come before God. If you feel like you would like to kneel with me, you might be thinking, I don't want to kneel. Look at me. Look at this doofus up on stage with the cameras on him. I'm kneeling. If you feel like you would like to kneel, feel free to kneel. You can lay out your hands, or if all you want to do is just close your eyes and bow your head, you can do that. But I know you. I know this church. And I know that there's a lot of suffering in this church. And have you cried out to God about your circumstances? Let us cry out together as one body, as brothers and sisters, as a family, to our loving Father who will not punish us for our intimacy, but he will draw in close and set you free.